Hey, everybody, what's up? This is Seth Williams, and I'm coming to you today with a kind of an interesting, unusual conversation. I'm talking with Brian Miller. Brian reached out to me not long ago because he's located in Shenzhen, China. Brian is a listener, and he wanted to share a little bit about what he's been seeing and experiencing from ground zero of the COVID-19 pandemic. I thought this would be an interesting conversation because, as everybody knows, China has always been at least a couple months ahead of the US and a lot of other places in the world, just in terms of, what this looks like. What is this going to do for the economy, for the health of people? Particularly, we wanted to talk about consumer behavior in China, just to see what the future will be like for other countries. So we've all had lots of questions and uncertainty throughout the whole crisis. And if we can get any insight into what the future might look like, I thought that would be valuable. So Brian, welcome. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I hope I can give the listeners a little bit of an idea of maybe what's to come for them.
Yeah.
Because China's been, a few months ahead in terms of the progression. And it's very likely what we see here, we'll see in the US and other places around the world, going forward.
What is it you do exactly in Shenzhen, China? I assume you're not a native Chinese person, correct?
Yeah, so I originally grew up in Connecticut,
Okay.
and I've been living in China for the past 10 years.
Okay.
I used to work for one of the largest Chinese state-owned, government-run manufacturers in the world, managing their export market. And now I run a 3PL, which is a logistics company that helps e-commerce sellers take their products after they've been manufactured in China and basically distribute them around the world. So that's what I do now. And we're located in Shenzhen, China, which for people that are not familiar with, it's the city that borders Hong Kong. So I know a lot of people kind of know where Hong Kong is on the map, and we're the border city to that.
That's actually a huge city, right? How many people live in that city?
Yeah, reportedly they have about 15 million people, but a lot of times in the outskirts of the city, you can, if you counted it a little wider, you could have, between 15 and 20 million people approximately in the surrounding area in Shenzhen.
So just to give you an idea for how large that particular city is. So maybe you can just tell us, Brian, what has life been like in China during this whole experience? Has the entire country just been totally shut down, with people locked in their homes, or is it just certain parts of China? Or tell us a little bit about the experience.
Yeah, sure. So I'll give everyone just kind of a brief timeline. So it feels like this has been going on forever, but it's actually only started a few months ago, right? So we have to keep that in mind. It feels like it's been years, right?
Yeah.
But actually, so we started hearing a little bit about the virus in China in December. And then the government officially announced this virus, with an official announcement on December 31st. And so from there on out, the first week and the second week of January, we saw a very quick ramp up of people wearing masks. So whereas in the US, they're a bit slow, within 2 weeks, we had about the whole population wearing masks. And then about a week or two later, so towards the end of January, most every public place had a temperature check. And by temperature check, I mean every time you went to the supermarket or the bank or into a mall, they would lock all the doors and open one entrance, and they would check your temperature on the way in with one of those temperature guns. Even roadblocks as well. So they had roadblocks at toll booths where they would check all the drivers. And even to my warehouse today, they've blocked off all the roads to the complex. And in order to enter by car, you need to have both the driver and the passengers get their temperature checked. And so that started at the end of January, right when it started to ramp up. And it still happens today. So every day I get my temperature checked probably 5 to 10 times.
Whoa. Holy cow.
And at the so it's really it's a lot different from probably what you're seeing in the US. And at the end of January is when they locked down Wuhan. So Wuhan, as many of us know now, is where the virus originated. And that city is also a 10 plus million person city. So by lockdown, they mean they shut down the whole city and didn't allow anyone in or out. And soon after that, they locked down the whole province, which is 80 million people. That would be like the equivalent to a state in the US.
Yeah.
And even where we are, which is about 1,000 miles south of that area, we had lockdown as well. So, and by lockdown, the government suggested that we don't go out, and people stayed in home, just like they are, isolating in the U.S. And all public places basically closed, restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. And there were even times where if you were close to an infected person, they would lock down even tighter. So you would get a ticket or two. And if you were within a few hundred yards to a, confirmed case, they would say, hey, you can use these tickets to go out and buy food once or twice a week. So they really started to restrict people's movements very, I would say, in an extreme way, specifically as, you got closer to confirmed cases. So that was kind of like how the first kind of month looked like in China.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, the whole temperature check thing, that has definitely not been happening in the U.S. There's testing is it's a pretty hard thing in general. The people that I know who have gotten tested, I mean, it was like a wait time of 5 to 11 days after doing the test to even know your results. So like by the time you even know, it's like, well,
yeah,
what's the point? Like it's been so long anyway.
What's the point? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm done with it already, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, just to confirm, like the temperature check, that's simply a measure of your temperature. It doesn't really tell you whether you have the virus. It's just, is there anything worth looking into further? Right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. So with those checks, it's just kind of a screening of the population just to kind of point out anything that might be abnormal. And if you did have a temperature, then they would do some further testing on you. Yeah. But also to keep in mind, we also in China have a few other like measures that they're doing. Mm-hmm. And one is like we have an app on our phone. Mm-hmm. And so this app can tell anyone that wants to look at it, our travel history, mm-hmm. as well as our health history. Mm-hmm. And it will tell us, it will tell the people like a restaurant or something, whether we're high risk or low risk. Mm-hmm. And also I had left China during this time for a few weeks and came back, and I was required to do a 14-day mandatory quarantine in my apartment.
Really? Wow.
And so, yeah, I couldn't leave the apartment. Mm-hmm. The building management, so the people who run the building, I could order food online and they would bring it up to me. Mm-hmm. And so I was completely isolated, like not even stepping outside my door was I allowed to do. Mm-hmm. And interesting as well was on the 10th day of the quarantine and the 14th day, I got a coronavirus test. Really? And so that was to ensure, and they gave the results within the afternoon, which mm-hmm. is pretty impressive as well.
More helpful.
And also throughout those 14-day quarantine, I was also given a temperature check twice a day that I reported to the building management and they reported to the government. So it was really a very strict check on people coming in because China was trying to avoid a lot of the inbound cases of people that were infected abroad coming in. And so those are the type of measures that they've been taking throughout this whole process.
Gotcha. Is that a temperature check you have to do on yourself and then you just report, or does somebody come in and do that for you? How does that work?
Yeah, so you just buy like a regular thermometer, mm-hmm. And you do it on yourself, and you send a photo of the temperature twice a day, in the morning and afternoon, to the building management. So it's like a self check mm-hmm. that they require throughout the whole process.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting just the whole mentality that people have in different parts of the world about government oversight and just Big Brother getting into your business and like seeing this kind of like mandatory testing and government telling you what you can and can't do. I know in the US, some people are fine with it, but some people are like really up in arms about it. Like, oh, no, like you can't do anything. In China, are people pretty like compliant with that? Like they're just like, okay, you're the boss, you do whatever you want, that's fine. Or do people like get upset about it, or how does that work culturally?
Yeah, so culturally, like I think Asia's a bit more collectivist. Like they want the greater good for society, mm-hmm. and so at least in China, they're quite okay with it to kind of protect society as a whole. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you have the added fact that like they have a one-party system in China, and you don't mm-hmm. really have the freedom of expression. A lot of the same freedoms that that we have in the West, right? So
Yeah.
so that's definitely a difference, like based on just the political system.
Mhm.
But I would just say also that culturally, they're also very kind of willing to do what's best for everyone, and they're kind of okay with sacrificing a little bit of their own. I don't know if you could call it freedom, but like free time or ability to go out, just so that their neighbors are also safe.
Yeah.
So I think that's like one of the big differences as well, and why also a lot of people wear masks here. It's not just to protect themselves, but it's also a measure so that they don't infect others.
Yeah.
And that's been kind of a common cultural thing. Whereas in Asia, we've seen people, not during pandemics, wear a mask when they have a cold, or like, when they're out in public and they don't feel well. It's very common to see someone wear a mask. So
Yeah.
I think that's a very different kind of cultural aspect that we have here.
Yeah, totally. Have you seen the movie American Factory on Netflix? Are you familiar with that?
No, I haven't. Should I?
Yeah,
What's it
I
about?
actually, I just, so I just saw it a couple of weeks ago, but it's about this factory in Dayton, Ohio that used to be a GM plant, and then it shut down. And then a Chinese company called Fuyao came in. They do automotive glass, and
Okay.
they send in a lot of Chinese workers to help like train up the American workers to like get everybody on the same page. And it just sort of, it talks about throughout the movie, it shows, it's like documentary style. So it's like actual, like live events. It's just showing the cultural difference
Mhm.
between the two, and just very different view of life and how the world works between Americans versus Chinese people. And at one point, when the Chinese people are getting acclimated to American culture, there's an instructor sort of telling them what to expect and how America is very different from China. And they're talking about like in America, like you can wear whatever you want, like you can tell people how you feel, you can even make fun of the president if you want to, like that's all okay here. And it also talks about how in America kids are told at a very young age like you're special and you can be whatever you want, and whatever you do, like yay, good for you, you're good at it, kind of thing. Whereas in China, it's not necessarily, that's just not the message delivered to everybody. I kind of had mixed about it. I mean, in some ways, I sort of get why American culture is that way. But on the other hand, it's like they really looked kind of very soft compared to a Chinese worker. Like Chinese workers will it seems like they'll work themselves to death just based on that documentary. Whereas American workers are much more, I don't know if entitled is the word, or if they just expect more reasonable conditions, or I guess it's up to everybody's personal definition of what that means. But just interesting to see the very different cultures coming together in ways that they were both impressed and unimpressed with one another from various points of view. So anyway,
I mean, you could also see the cultural differences in how they approach the virus. Like each country has kind of taken its own approach, whether it be China or different Asian countries or Europe, or the US. And
yeah,
I think it's also a reflection of the political system and the culture and how
yeah,
people
totally.
kind of react to in their lifestyle, and what the government can really do. How far can it go in certain ways?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to see because every country has kind of gone a different route. And
Mm-hmm.
not some are similar, some are different, but everyone has their own kind of method to go about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting too. I know just in the different news headlines that I've seen throughout this whole thing in the US, like a common thought that I've had through all of it is like just not really knowing what to believe. I almost feel like in a way it becomes this like politicized, political mess, so to speak, where like one side is all about one approach and the other side is about the other approach. And it's been kind of frustrating because you just see two very different messages delivered. One is saying like this is all an overblown hysteria and there's nothing to worry about. The other side is like we're all going to die. Like this is the worst thing ever. I'm just like, which is it? I get conflicting
Yeah.
messages all day long, and it's not like that in China, right? Everybody's kind of on the same page, would you say? Or
Regardless of which kind of side you're on, which political belief you have, I think it's kind of a bit unfortunate that it has to be so, both sides are so polarized, and in such a big crisis, they are having trouble coming together and kind of working together to have a a reasonable solution. I think it's sad to see. Obviously, in China, you don't really have two parties. You have one stronger, centralized government that makes all the decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's been relatively effective in China because they've been able to do the containment measures as a whole country at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do see in the US, not just political sides going at each other, but also you have the separation of the federal government and the state power, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have some states closing, some states not. And so there's not really kind of a concerted effort together as a whole country to kind of do either an isolation altogether or not. And so I think what you're going to have is an issue where, the states that don't really close hard, the virus is going to be able to spread more rapidly and longer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to hurt the states that did do isolation because once they open up, the states that didn't will pass it back to the states that were isolating. And I think you're going to see in the US like a big virus whack-a-mole game. Like we all know we played whack-a-mole when we were kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see this kind of, coming through in the future for the US where you're trying to clamp it down in different places because there's no concerted effort. So that's what I'm concerned about for the US when I compare it to the China response.
Yeah, I've always kind of thought from the very beginning, it's like you either have to like shut everything down for like a year, like kind of what China does, like just martial law, everybody has to do this, or just kind of don't bother with it. Because like just this partial thing, I can see how it might like flatten the curve a little bit in the beginning, but like it's just kind of kicking the can down the road. It's not like we're really going to escape it if we don't really everybody take it seriously.
It's going to be a tough thing to solve. And I think before, if we don't get a vaccine or some type of medical cure for it, I think it's going to be spread and contract and spread and contract as we open our economy and close it. And we're going to have these kind of openings and contractions until we kind of solve the basic problem, which is just the virus, right? Yeah, so I think that's what we'll see in the future, definitely for 2020. And then let's see in 2021 how fast we're able to come up with a medical solution for sure. The virus.
Are you guys currently shut down still, or have things officially started to open back up? Where is it at? Like, and by the way, this is being recorded as of April 27. So where are things at today?
Yeah, so I'll just go back a little bit, but in February was the end of Chinese New Year. Mm-hmm. And so during all of February, we were very slow to open. So, people started slowly kind of coming out. A few restaurants here and there were allowed to open, and the government was letting them open very slowly. And also factories and warehouses like mine slowly opened in February. And then March, we saw a lot more places open. However, we did see a large amount of kind of consumer fear in the market. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean, like, even though people were allowed to go out and the government even kind of encouraged it to get the economy moving, mm-hmm. people were just so kind of traumatized. Like, it was such a traumatic experience, mm-hmm. The whole event, that they were worried about kind of going back out and eating at restaurants and just kind of being in public in general. Mm-hmm. And so in March, we saw a very slow recovery. I mean, not like people were saying where China was recovering quickly. It was actually recovering very, 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 very slowly. Mm-hmm. And I have a friend that owns a restaurant, and his sales were down 70%. Yeah. The first month that they opened, and they're still not recovering. So, in April, he's like down 60%. Mm-hmm. And so if sales don't improve, he hasn't paid his rent. And if his landlord requires him to pay the rent, he's going to go bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And so after the virus, was kind of settled and people started opening up, we saw a large amount of bankruptcies. So a lot of shops just didn't open. They just were closed after the, we got back, and they were closed because they went bankrupt. And now we're seeing that even though there's a large portion of them open, mm-hmm. they're actually not selling enough. They don't have enough traffic to actually pay their rent. And so they're actually bankrupt, but they're still open. So once the landlord requires them to pay rent, they're going to close down. So we're slowly seeing like all of these companies starting to get washed through the system. And it seems to be getting worse before it will get better. So people are going out more, but we see the economic effects getting worse and worse, actually. The underlying ones, you know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Has there been like a big spike in new COVID-19 cases, like once things started opening back up? Or is it kind of just, has the curve stayed relatively flat, or what has happened with the disease in particular?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, overall, we know a lot of people don't trust the Chinese numbers in general, like the total cases. And there's a lot of people that are skeptical about that. But I would say, even from my experience, like also Chinese citizens are also a bit skeptical themselves about it. So they're also a little bit weary of how true those numbers are.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I think people are a bit concerned, but they're also concerned that there might be some community spread that's not being reported. Now, there were a few community spread places that were reported on the border of Russia to China. There was a small outbreak again of COVID after everything was settled. And so the government's trying to deal with that. And then in Guangzhou, which is a city quite close to where I am in the south of China, there was some community spread in Guangzhou. And once that happened, and that's just happened in the last week or two. And once that happened, people stopped going out again. And so we see the same kind of pattern where there's like a small amount of community spread and people get scared again, and then they go back in their houses. And then the economy suffers greatly from that. So we are seeing it to a small degree in China happening in certain isolated places. Yep.
So it sounds like there's inevitably going to be probably a lot of businesses that will like permanently shut down as a result of this, right? But it's probably at the current moment, they're sort of like right on the edge. Like maybe they're going to, sort of depends on how quickly sales continue to tick back up, but it's moving really, really slow. But do you foresee a lot of companies just going under forever because of this?
Yeah, I see it getting much worse before it gets better. So sales are not, they're not improving in a very strong uptick, like a strong, a very, people talk about V recoveries and U recoveries, and that's kind of the shape at which the economy will recover. And we're not seeing a very, very strong trend line back up. And so if sales continue to stay low, people won't be able to pay their overhead, and they'll continue to start, defaulting and going bankrupt. And so I think this is going to get worse as we go forward.
Yeah. And this probably depends on the type of business, right? Like I could see how a restaurant would have a much harder time than, like, for example, I'm assuming your shop is open back up and you guys are operating. Is that correct? Or you guys shut down?
Yeah.
Still?
I mean, we do e-commerce fulfillment. So we're actually shipping for e-commerce companies. So people that sell online, and our business is up obviously because more people are buying stuff online. So we're shipping for them. So for a business like us, it's great, right? Like medical businesses, e-commerce businesses, those type of businesses are great. But what we're seeing in China, specifically restaurants, are really having a very, very hard time. Retail is having a very hard time. And then you'll probably see a little bit of the corporate real estate market start to take a bit of a pain as larger companies start to default or they're not able to pay their bills. So I would say those are the three main that are really having a bit of trouble.
Gotcha. I don't know how much insight you have into this, but like the landlords who are not getting rent, like, do you think they're just going to sort of take a hit for a couple months and resume at a later date? Or are they going to like put the missed rent on payments or something? Or have you heard anything about how landlords are handling that?
So this is a great question. It kind of also relates to what the Chinese government is doing as far as stimulus. So contrary to what the U.S. is doing, where the government's giving out a lot of money to people.
Mm.
The Chinese are actually giving out no money. Like
Huh.
no one gets money.
Yeah.
And so
That's kind of
they're kind
surprising
of
for me.
doing that yeah.
I mean, it
So,
almost seems
and I
backwards.
think
Like if anybody would give out money, it would be China and not the U.S., but it's kind of been the other way around, huh?
exactly. And I think this is a little bit painful for Americans to hear, but from what I've seen, actually the Chinese approach to it is far more capitalistic. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
when you look at the core values of capitalism
Mm-hmm.
than the US method. The US
Yeah.
is more socialist in what it's
Mm-hmm.
doing now.
Wow.
And the Chinese are actually letting the weaker companies that don't have cash and are highly indebted and levered to fail. And the strong companies are surviving,
Mm-hmm.
and they're rebuilding their economy based on that premise, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they're not going to allow zombie companies to survive or bad run companies.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing at least the landlords are also being pretty tough here. So
Mm-hmm.
they are not giving a lot of leeway.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't pay your rent, they're generally evicting people because they have hopes that like new tenants will come in
Mm-hmm.
and they will be able to replace that rent relatively quickly. Now, whether they're right or not, I don't know. But at least the people that I know that run restaurants, there's not a lot of negotiation room that we've seen in China between the tenant and the landlord.
That's not what I would have expected, but yeah, I mean, I know
I can
everybody's
see it
talking
in your
about.
face.
Well, everybody's talking about how the U.S. dollar is just going to like tank because there's just trillions of new dollars being created with all the stimulus packages and all that. I don't see how there's any way around that. And just like from a purely capitalistic perspective, it almost seems like China is a lot smarter in that regard.
It's a hard statement to make, but I would also agree that I think the Chinese approach is better. I do see the reason why you need to help people who, lose their jobs, etc. But I think the US approach does incentivize bad and poor business behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can run a poor company and if you could lever your debt to infinity or very high, and then when a crisis happens, you get bailed out. I think that provides the wrong incentives in the economy, and it will continue this kind of very, very strong debt-ridden economy to keep going that way.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not really, if people never touch the hot stove, then they
Yeah.
never learn, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the biggest thing that I'm concerned about when you look at the two economies. And I think the China approach is a more logical, thought out, and prudent approach to kind of maintain the
Yeah.
proper market forces within the economy.
Are people just like starving there or something? Like what happens? Because I understand what you're saying, and I think I'd agree for the most part in terms of, if you're running a cash poor business and if you can't weather a storm, then like maybe you shouldn't be in business in the first place. Like there's some merit to that. I think what makes this different is that it's just such a crazy, unpredictable, like really the modern world has never seen anything like this before. It's not a result of like foolish decisions by the market as a whole. It's like this is just a crazy thing that nobody was prepared for. And I do wonder, like, just the unemployment claims alone have been like many, many, many times higher than they've ever been before in the US. What if there was no stimulus checks? Like, what if everybody was just sort of cut off at the source when this happened? What would people do? Like, would they starve to death, or what would happen? Like, what's going on in China with all that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the big difference about China compared to the U.S. is the savings rate. So Chinese in general, they save a much larger portion of their income.
Yeah.
And so society, so not only just individuals, but I think companies have a bit more cash on their balance sheet.
Mm-hmm.
And so that allows, when I talk to my Chinese friends, they say, you mean, a few months of us not with income? Of course we can weather that. Why would we ever not be able to weather 3 months of no income, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it that way, it seems absurd that an American cannot do that. Like they don't have enough money to even pay their bills for the next month. And so I think that's the difference, which is there's a saver society. And they also value that savings. And the US, as we know, is a very consumer driven, very debt fueled society. So we buy things on credit. We buy our car on credit. We buy our education on credit. We buy our house on credit. We buy our iPhone on credit. We have payments on everything. And so once you, you stumble and you kind of lose that 1 month of income, it starts feeling very painful very quickly. And I think that's the big difference. Now, I don't know. I also, like you, don't know what's the right approach. I don't know what makes the most sense. And could we not give people these stimulus checks, and would people survive? I don't know that question. I don't know if I'm smart enough to know. But I think the differences are stark, and they are interesting to note, that there is that difference.
Yeah.
And there is a country that's able to do it,
Yeah, I had interviewed a friend of mine, Rich Carey, in episode 7 of our podcast. And Rich, his story is he owns, it's probably more now, but at the time he owned 20 rental properties free and clear, which I thought that was a big deal because that's just so uncommon for somebody to own that many rentals with no debt on them. Turns out his wife is Chinese, and I was talking to him about that, and he was saying when he first met her, he had debt here and there and this kind of thing, and she was just like, I can't believe you would have this debt like this. This is unacceptable. Like, you can't have debt. And he was explaining that in Chinese culture,
right,
like what you're saying, like debt is like not okay. Like, you don't do that. You don't just like have a bunch of loans owing to people. And so like first line of business was she got a second job, and they like just worked their tails off to pay off all their debt. And it was just kind of an interesting dynamic. You can sort of see the differences in philosophy there about debt.
Of course. And I think also Chinese will live below their means in order to stay out of debt, right?
Yeah.
So that and to save money. Whereas I think a little bit different in the US, where we will live actually more than our means because we can add debt to our personal balance sheet, right? So I think it's a bit different philosophy kind of that we have. Yeah.
Well, do you have any predictions about what the U.S. might see in the days to come? I mean, it's probably really hard to do that because, as we've discussed here, the two worlds are just universes apart from each other in some ways. But do you have any guesses as to how things might pan out in the next couple months for the U.S.? I mean, I know that's a really hard thing to predict because, as we've talked about, there's just a ton of differences. So maybe it's impossible to know, but any wild guesses?
Yeah, I would say just, from simple things like the Chinese, they recovered relatively quickly in regards to the virus kind of slowing transmission. And I think it was a result of those kind of extreme measures that I talked about in the beginning. And so since the U.S. is not doing those, I think the U.S. recovery will be longer. So it sounds very simple, but if people don't know what China did, their actual actions, they will assume that, it will only take 2 months.
Yeah.
And so I don't really believe that for the U.S. It's going to take much longer. And then I think actually for the U.S., we're still in the very, very early innings of the game. And I think what people need to think about is that once you bend the curve, or whatever they say, flatten the curve, what you've done is you've helped a lot of the healthcare workers and the hospitals not become overloaded. And that's great. And that helps save lives, et cetera, and we want that. But you still haven't fixed the economic problem, which is people are still scared to go out and spend money because the virus is still there.
Yeah.
And so whether you have deaths go up or down, it's kind of irrelevant because the economy is still going to have a hard time getting that consumer to go out again and getting them to spend money. And so I think people should think that, okay, yes, it's not spreading as much, but we have a very hard, long road economically to go. And we've just started. So that's what I'd say from what I see in China and what we're seeing on the ground here. So I think it's important for people to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, when I just think about certain
Sorry to be so gloomy. Sorry to jump on and be so gloomy and pessimistic.
Oh, man. No. Sometimes the truth is just painful. There's just no way around that. Yeah, that's I think about like industries like airlines and cruise ships and stuff like that. It's what a nightmare. Like I don't I can't imagine being in any of those businesses right now. Like just personally, like there was a trip we were planning to do this summer that like I'm 90% sure we're not going to do it anymore simply because like, well, hey, coronavirus everywhere. So why would we expose ourselves, Whether or not that's well founded or not, I don't
Right.
know, but that's what's going on in my head. I think of like
Exactly.
cruise ships as being just like I can't think of a worse place to get exposed to that kind of virus. And it's going to be a long time, I think, before they're back to normal the way it always was. Sort of like that vaccine has to get
Yeah.
here, or we need lots of time for things to stabilize.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just because, like, even though the virus actually might not be dangerous, but you're still mentally scared, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just enough for consumers not to go out and do that trip and do that travel and go to the restaurant and go to the movie theater, et cetera, et cetera. And so yeah, it's going to be tough for people to get over that mind block and for businesses to get back to normal.
I think it's important what you were talking about in terms of we're in the early innings of the game and how the US's recovery is probably going to be a lot slower than China has been. I know like in the minds of most real estate investors right now, for better or worse, a thought that many people are having is like probably going to be a lot of cheap real estate out there, like really inexpensive opportunities to invest in that weren't there before. But I think it's still going to be a while before we see that because the impact of the joblessness and the loss of income, I mean, it's just not there yet. And obviously, like, it's a tragedy for anybody to lose their home or to lose a job. But just like the economic reality of it playing out in terms of foreclosures or people moving, whatever the result of that is, it's just a little too soon to see any of that yet. It'll probably be several months, I would think, before a lot of that really starts to show itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Like, it's going to take a little while to go through the system. And also, I think people should think about, like, after, are we going to get out of this in the same world that we entered it, right?
Yeah.
Like will retail be important anymore? Will everyone be so used to going online, going on Amazon, going on those type of places? Like, will restaurant or retail real estate be a strong place to put your money in the future? I don't know. I'm not an expert on that, but it goes into question like, how will the changes in consumer behavior affect the value of certain assets in the market, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's something that people should be thinking about as we start going through the crisis for sure.
Yeah. No, that's a great insight. I know I've heard people talking about like office space in particular. Like, will there be the same demand for that anymore? Or I don't know, like
Right.
or
Why not
retail,
just
like you were
everyone
saying.
work at home, right?
Yeah.
Or even,
Right.
yeah, like even warehouses. Like maybe there's going to be a huge demand for warehouse space because people are going to be buying everything online. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens after
Yeah.
this. And
I think a lot of us sort of instinctively knew this even years ago that there's a lot of interpersonal communication that is nice to have in person, but it doesn't have to be in person. Like there are more efficient
right.
ways to do a lot of that on something like Zoom or Skype. And now that we're sort of forced to do that and realize more of that, it's like, yeah, a lot of these things that we all just commonly did in person, I wonder how many of those things are just going to not happen that way anymore because it's more work to do it that way.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see, and people should think about it as they allocate their capital.
Well, Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about this and inform our listeners and viewers about what life has been like in China. If people want to find out any more about you or your company, how can they do that?
Yeah, sure. They can just look us up on the internet at easychinawarehouse.com. And if anyone wants to send me an email just to have any questions about China, that's cool. You don't have to talk about logistics like what I do. Brian, Brian, at easychinawarehouse.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Brian. I'll wherever you're seeing this or hearing this, I'll include that information as well. So I wish you all the best. I wish you
Thanks for having me.
health and economic prosperity, and hopefully somehow we'll all get through this in the best possible shape.
I agree. I hope so.
All right. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot.